Is local web development environments made easy with Docker and Lando. Sit down, Ryan. My name is Dustin Harrell. I own and run a small dev shop here in Asheville called Avenue Media. Focused primarily on Drupal-related projects, but also do WordPress and Vue.js projects as well. When you think about Lando, a lot of people may be thinking of this Lando. But this is not the correct Lando. We're looking for someone a little bit more modern, and a lot of you might be thinking, okay, this guy's more modern. This is the Lando. No. We're looking for something a little more high-tech and DevOpsy. So Lando is actually a free, open-source, cross-platform local development tool and DevOps tool built on Docker container technology. It was developed by Tandem. The project lead on that is Mike Pirog. He was actually on the Calabox project as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about what makes Lando so great, why you would want to potentially leverage it over, a local LAMP stack or something like a MAMP, if you guys are familiar with that, and how it can make things a whole lot easier for you, what languages are supported out of the box with Lando, how you can get started with recipes. We're going to go through the process of configuring and modifying a Drupal 8 recipe to show you really what you can do with it out of the box with very little to no configuration at all. It's just so simple. We'll look at the anatomy of the Lando file to kind of give you an idea of what's really possible with it and give you a starting point, something to look at, as well as the supported services out of the box where there are already Docker images for a number of services that just function with Lando. We'll customize the recipes, of course. We'll look at adding services and defining a proxy or a vanity URL for those services so you can access things like phpMyAdmin or Solr via the local web browser. And we'll configure tooling, so customize commands you might want to run in your local development environment like Drush. We'll also look at utilizing build steps, so when you spin up a project for the first time, Composer installs, and then maybe you import your configuration management, clear the caches, update the database, that sort of thing, utilizing build steps and events. And we'll look at Lando CLI so you can get a feel for what you can really do with it out of the box. So let's do it. Let's take a peek. So Lando is built on Docker. So there's no need to manage local services, which can be a nightmare if you've been developing websites for a while where you need different versions of PHP or MySQL or all these different local services installed on your machine. It can just clutter things up. It can be hard to maintain. You'll leave a project, you'll come back to it, and things just won't work. And Docker helped to solve that problem by allowing you to create Docker images that you can then download. You have a Docker Compose file, assuming if anyone has any Docker experience at all, but there's a Docker Compose file that you can utilize that stores in your repository that has basically a text file of all of your configuration. But that can be really complicated to manage. You have to learn a lot. You have to create your own images in a lot of cases, and it can just be a bit painful if you're not a DevOps expert. If you're more along the vein of front-end developer like me, Lando just makes things a lot easier. It just really does. So it simplifies managing those containers through its abstraction layer, and the configuration, again, is a single file that lives in Git, so you can ship that out to other developers. They can spin up the project. They've got all the same tools and resources. You can also configure your environment to match production environments, so the same versions of PHP, MySQL, all of that can be installed so you know that things are going to work when you go live. And beyond that, it's really highly configurable, even down to the Docker Compose level itself. So you can really get all you need with Docker. A DevOps developer could actually configure everything in a simple format, add a new feature, and leverage Docker and Docker Compose, and then make that available to anyone else that's on the project. There are a few dependencies. Really, you just need a modern operating system. So Mac OS 10.11 or newer, Windows 10 Pro or newer, Linux kernel 4, of course a 64-bit processor. Lando documentation says you need at least 8 gigs of RAM or in a 10 gigabyte hard drive, but I highly recommend 16 gigs of RAM and at least 128 gigabyte hard drive, especially if you're downloading lots of Docker images for different services that you have installed. You can start bloating the operating system this space really quickly. And then Docker. But there's no need to install Docker because Lando actually does that for us. It installs the proper version of Docker necessary for the version of Lando that you install. So it's really easy. There's a link here where you can actually download the latest release, which is what I'm using in all of the documentation you're going to see moving forward. So Lando supports Node.js, PHP, Ruby, Python, Go, and Microsoft.NET. And yes, I did say Microsoft.NET. Apparently you can do this. I've never tried it, but there's documentation around it. So all you Microsoft developers out there. Recipes is really where I think Lando shines. It just makes things really easy. They're basically the highest level of abstraction with common combinations of all the tooling and services that you need in a really simple format. There are recipes for Drupal 6, 7, and 8, for Joomla, WordPress, Backdrop, Pantheon, Laravel. There's a mean stack, lamp stack, and you can create custom ones as well. As far as getting started, you can run the Lando init command. So if you have a working directory, in this example, I'm using my own flavor of the Pantheon D8 Drops Composer project, which is similar to Drupal Composer for building my source code. And if you changed into the directory where all of your files exist, or you cloned out your repository, you'll just run Lando init. You select that you're running from the current working directory. Otherwise, you can clone from GitHub as your starter repo, Pantheon, or a remote repository or archive. You can then select the version of the recipe you'd like to install. In our case, we're going to use Drupal 8. And then we can select the web root relative to where the Lando file exists. So Drupal project builds to the web folder. So we're going to select web. If you just downloaded Drupal directly from Drupal.org and unzipped it, it would just be a dot for your current working directory. And then we name it. So we give it a machine name of example. And that machine name is used to name space all of your containers, as well as your vanity URL that comes out of the box when everything's set up. One of the things that I think makes Lando kind of fun, being in code all day long, is they put these little, now we're cooking with fire, right? Mike's made it a little bit fun. So let's get this party started. You start your app, and when you see boom shakalaka, your app is up and running, and you've got your vanity URLs. So by default, it's going to ship with a URL that it creates that's .lndo.site. You could configure additional top-level domains if you wanted to through something like DNSMask, or you could even update your local host file if you have a specific top-level domain that you prefer to use. But .lndo.site just works out of the box. It also installs SSL certificates for us, which is kind of great. And you'll notice, once I've got my project up and running, it's reading from my web directory, Drupal's been installed, and I can go through the actual installation process to set up the database. We don't have any database connection information, but Lando also makes that easy, and it's really, with the version of the recipe that you would install, if you're using that same recipe, it's you know what the database user and credentials are based on the recipe name. When you're in the CLI, if you run Lando info and then the name of your app that you're running, it'll basically just spit out a JSON array that you can scroll through to find all the information that you need as it relates to your current running app. Here I've just kind of added some ellipses to kind of hide some things. So you can see we've got a database of Drupal 8, we've got a password of Drupal 8, user of Drupal 8, and default MySQL port names. Then we can go through the process of installing. Once you've worked through the installer, you've got a fully functioning local Drupal development environment without having to really install much as far as tooling on your local system. So it's super easy to kind of get started. You will need a little bit, of course, of understanding of command line and all of that, but there's great documentation around that on Lando's website. So we can talk a bit about the anatomy of the Lando file, kind of getting an understanding of what you can really do in the configuration and what's provided by default as part of your recipe. So the name is essentially just the machine name of your application. Compose allows you to list out a number of additional Docker Compose files that you want to spin up with your app that can then get mapped to services, and you can use those. You can load local environmental variable files, env files for something like a API key that you don't want to have checked into the repository. There are events which you can piggyback on to trigger commands. So it's really at any point in the life cycle of the Lando run process. There's a pre-start, post-start. There's a handful of all of these commands, post-install, and we can look at some of those as well. I've got an example in here where we'll use the post-rebuild event to actually trigger importing the Drupal configuration via drush commands. Of course, you'll have your recipe, which is basically just a text representation of which recipe that you're currently running. That allows Lando to know which Docker images to download to get everything up and cooking. And then you've got your config, which is basically your recipe configuration. This will just be where you can provide additional options that the recipe supports. There is a proxy variable that you can set where you can customize vanity URLs for each of your individual services. We're going to set up PHP MyAdmin here in a minute, and I'll show you what that looks like. As well as a list of services that your app implements, like MySQL or Node, as well as tooling, so any sort of custom commands you'd like to run against services. Really just kind of exposing things like npm to your local, so you can have a different version of, you can have a version of Node running inside of your container, so you don't have to use messy things like nvm to install a specific Node version for this project. It's just all exists within Lando, and you can expose those commands and actually run them, which we'll look at as well. So some of the services that that are already configured, that are just basically Docker containers that are meant to run with Lando. Each of these services have their own build steps. So as part of the build process, you could run composer install, things like that, which we'll need for Drupal project to actually build our source code the first time we run it. Essentially, the goal is if you hand this off to a developer, they spin the project up the first time, it runs composer install, it installs all of our Node modules, it compiles the dist folder for the theme, and everything just works. There are services, there's almost too many to really mention here. Apache, Compose, which would be your custom Docker Compose file services, .NET, Elasticsearch, MariaDB, PHP MyAdmin. So let's customize our Drupal 8 recipe. This is really all it looks like. So I'm just catting out the file here. There's just 3 essentially variables here. There's the name, the recipe, the config, and then as part of the config, the web root as far as where Drupal exists, where things are getting built to. But it's really easy to kind of plug and play and change services out. So if you want to use Nginx, you can easily just add via, and Nginx, you can even specify with a colon the specific version of Nginx you'd like to run in this particular instance. You can modify the version of PHP that you're going to run inside of your Drupal 8 recipe. You can easily set up Xdebug, which I found super great, is it just works out of the box. Through path mappings, basically what Lando does is it's automatically going to mount the directory in which Lando exists to a folder called app. And so you can just use path mappings to set up Xdebug very, very quickly out of the box. It's going to use the default port 9000, which is already going to be configured inside of PHP Storm. But all of this stuff can be customized if necessary. If you're using port 9000 for something else, it's really easy to change that. We can also swap out the database. I'm going to use MariaDB here. And we can install Drush. We want to use Drush 8 or comparable, and you can now call Drush via Lando Drush, so you don't have to install Drush locally. That's already in the container. You don't have to manage multiple versions of Drush. I will say that sometimes there's a slight bit of latency, but overall it works very, very well. And this function is just as custom tooling does, so anything that is Lando in the name of the command, you can do this through custom tooling. So we're going to expose npm and Node, so we could run our build process, or npm start if we're designing some front-end code. So let's look at adding a service. We're just going to add phpMyAdmin. So services, again, is just another array of items. phpMA is the name of the service that I'm going to call it. So much like example was the name of our app, phpMA is going to be the name of this particular service, and it is going to be of the type phpMyAdmin. And next, we need to be able to access that via URL easily. You can set up a proxy here of phpma.example.lndo.site. And again, if you want to use custom top-level domains, you can. It's really easy to do that if you'd like to set up DNS mask or update host files. And now we're up and running with phpMyAdmin. You can also set up Solar. And there are lots of additional configuration items within the scope of each of these services. They basically have their own config, depending on the type of service. All of this is documented on Lando's website. But Solar is a very typical use case scenario for myself. I'm using Search API, and it's really easy to set up. So again, defining a new service called Solar with a type of Solar, the version of Solar that I want to use, configuring my port forward. And also, for the Solar service, there's a config value you can set, and you can specify your configuration, so where your Solar config exists within, relative to where your Lando file is, essentially. So you can have all that imported. And then again, setting up another proxy URL for Solar. It's very important that you name the service the same in each of these cases. So this is where you define your service called Solar. Here's where you're basically setting a proxy for the service called Solar as this. I've typed things wrong many times. So. And now we're up and cooking with Solar. Don't know why you'd ever need to access this interface, really. One of the things to note is that if you are familiar with Solar, the default Solar core is called Lando, but you can change that if you want to via config variable. Front-end tooling. And here's where we're going to talk about setting up NPM scripts in Node and exposing those to the Lando CLI. We're going to basically define another service here with the service name of Node, type Node, and then we are going to use tooling to define new commands. So by default, Lando is going to try to see if this command exists on this particular service and then just use it, expose it to you. You could even create custom names here and define them and run additional commands. All this is documented, so if you wanted to run some local testing, bhat testing or PHP unit testing, you can configure all of these really, really easily. So we're exposing the application or the command line interface for NPM to Lando from the service node. We're also going to expose the node command from the service node, and now you can run Lando NPM or Lando node. So no need to really manage a specific version of Node for your project and having to, again, use NVM or something like that to switch versions. It's just going to use the version that gets installed by default. And again, you can also specify the colon for the type here to run a very specific version of Node. So depending on your circumstances, if you need 8, 9, 10, 11, or whatever, you can define all of that here. Super granular. Build steps is where it kind of gets fun for me. So we've got our service called Node with the type of Node. This is what's been added. So as part of our build process, we're going to run npm install and npm run build. So npm install I have configured just to install all of my Node modules and my theme. And npm run build is basically creating my distribution folder and compiling all my Sass and JavaScript down to the distribution for the app. And again, we've got tooling with npm exposed and node exposed. So essentially what's happening is on Lando rebuild, which is part of this build process, there's a handful of additional options that you can specify here, like build. There's build as root. There's a number of other items that you could use if you need to. But basically, every time Lando rebuild is run, then npm install is going to happen and npm run build is going to happen. So it just keeps things really simple. Yeah.
Does that mean like your package JSON has to be in the directory relative to the Lando YAML file, or is it in your theme folder?
Yes, but if you did want, so what I typically do in my projects is I have a package.json in the theme, and then I have a package.json in the root of the directory that basically calls npm install from the theme. And I can show you what that looks like. I've got the repository on here. But yeah, you could even specify npm, so npm install. You'd have to have it local to that, but you could probably even write like changing the directory directly into the proper folder that you need to run npm install inside, but it is a lot easier if you have two package.json files. That's a good question. And here, we're going to add a new build step for the app server itself. So when the app starts for the first time, if you've got a new developer on the project and they run npm or Lando start, it's basically going to build the project from scratch. And anytime, which is going to run through this build process of running composer install to make sure that all of those other project dependencies get installed, that all of our source code is built into the web directory, and our app can actually load. And then each time you need to reinstall composer modules, you can do that manually, or you can run Lando rebuild, and it'll just kind of force that install to happen. Lando rebuild doesn't destroy any of the data in the database. It's just basically taking down all the containers and rebuilding them while still maintaining the integrity of the data that's stored in the database. There is another command that you can use that will blow away all that information. And then there's also Lando restart, which just basically spins them down and back up without implementing any new configuration. Events, we'll look at post rebuild. So anytime the Lando app is built, either it's the first time or being rebuilt, it's now going to run drush config import, drush update db, and of course clearing the caches in case we've installed any new modules. We don't want any white screen of death here. And now anytime the app is rebuilt, it will just do that. There may be instances where you don't want to use rebuild, and there's a ton of events that you could actually use to trigger your commands from. Next is the Lando CLI. So this is basically just a list of all the commands that you have available to you. Lando config just displays your existing Lando configuration. Lando destroy will actually blow away your app, where it actually deletes all the database information. Everything gets blown away. There are instances where a new version of Lando might come out, and you might have to destroy the app. Always back up your database, of course, before you do that. And then you can destroy and re-import things. Lando info will spit out all of the detailed information regarding your app in that JSON array that we looked at early. That's where we were able to find the database, user, password, all of that information. Lando list will actually list all of the apps that are currently running, all the individual containers themselves. So you can get an idea of, my computer is really slow, what is going on? And if you've left 15 sites all running at the same time. Lando logs allows you to get the log information for a very specific app or container, which is great. You don't have to use Docker execute commands and those sort of things. It just makes it a whole lot simpler. Lando power off will spin down all of your related Lando containers and turn everything off. Lando rebuild basically just rebuilds everything from scratch, preserving data, as it says. Lando restart starts the containers. One thing that's cool, but it's not super practical, depending on the size of the site, is Lando share, which allows you to share your local development environment via URL to someone outside of your local network. So you can actually see a running site on your local very easily. It gives you a URL that'll just get spit out. You can provide that to an end user. They can open it up and click around. It's nice in some instances where you need a little help from maybe another developer, or you want to demo something that's pretty simple. But then again, a lot of that's going to depend on your internet connection speed But it does work, and it works pretty consistently. There have been issues with different Lando versions where it's been broken over time, but it's working very, very well in the latest release. Lando SSH allows you to SSH directly into your container, so you can run commands there. If it's a command that you don't run very often, it makes sense maybe to SSH in and run the command there. Whereas if it's a command that you use all the time, like npm or node, to run like just building your source code for your theme or whatever, then you can expose those via the tooling that we looked at. Of course, Lando start and stop will start and stop your app, and Lando version will display the version of Lando that you're currently running. It's really easy to get started. I've got a starter repo here on my GitHub page that has all of the code that I used to build this project and all the testing that I did. It also uses the Pantheon D8 drops composer project to build our Drupal 8 project, and it includes all of the stuff that we've seen today. You can also go to the Lando GitHub page to download the release. There's also incredibly detailed documentation at docs.lndo.io. And one of the things that I've found super valuable is the Slack channel. Mike's on there all the time. There's lots of other devs that are on there on a regular basis. So I think last year sometime, none of my containers would start up. And it was because I think the default Docker images they had at the time were using MySQL latest, and a new version of MySQL rolled out, so it broke a lot of things. And they were super responsive as far as helping me to come up with a fix. I didn't have to pay anything. Just a really great community. Lots of information in there. But yeah, does anybody have questions? Yeah.
So on your very first, at the very beginning when you're showing, start spinning up your initial instance or container or whatever you call it.
Right.
How is, so you picked a Drupal 8.
Mm-hmm.
What if we're wanting to move from a different solution that we're using now for containers to Lando?
Okay.
So we've already got Drupal installed and all that. How do you tell it to I guess suck all that in and create instances of that?
Well, you would have a backup of your database for sure, but inside of your working directory, wherever you have Drupal installed,
right,
you would just do Lando init and then choose the flavor and where your document root is for Drupal, the doc root.
It already exists.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So you would just hit decimal. It'd be the current working directory if it's you're not using a composer-based build process for Drupal.
Which we are.
If you are, then it's typically going to be the web folder. Are you using Drupal project or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. Yeah, then you would just specify web like I did. Yeah.
Okay.
So you will literally create an instance in 15, 30 minutes, if that.
Yeah, it's less than that. I mean, there is time to download the Docker images, but if you already have them all installed and you're using the Drupal 8 recipe for other projects, I mean, starting and spinning up a project literally, 30 seconds and you're up and running.
That they'll spin up a website, work on their work, and then destroy the website, and just spin it up from scratch every single time.
Okay.
Because they want to save disk space or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
game changing.
Yeah. And Docker is notorious for storing all these images on your local machine. I would hope that there would be a way to clear out the Lando Docker images from your local machine, but there's no command for that.
There are some third-party tools that
will do stuff
aren't
like
great, but they'll at least give you a list
Yeah.
of all of these 2 to 4 gig things filling up your hard drive.
Right.
And also Docker, I don't understand it entirely, but Docker itself creates a volume on your drive that's like by default 40 gigs. And when you fill that up, Docker just...
Yeah, I've had that happen before,
Yeah.
where you would spin up a project and
Can't
Docker
write
would
to it.
crash.
Like all these weird errors start
Yeah.
happening,
But-
and you realize you just filled that volume.
Yeah, but the nice thing is you can go through the Docker UI and then increase storage space and restart Docker and you're back up and running, assuming that you have more storage space that you can allocate to it. Otherwise, then you have to remove Docker images. But there are Docker commands that you can run to get a list of all your images, and you can delete those images as needed. That's a little bit more advanced, but it'd be great if Lando actually implemented some way for us to delete those images. And Mike was actually supposed to be here, and he's not, obviously. But I was going to ask him that. Yeah. Any other questions?
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I was going to say, kind of go back and motivate me why I want to use this over just Docker.
Well, I mean,
Docker Compose.
well, you could do it with Docker Compose.
Right.
I mean, the real beauty of it is that if you don't really have to know Docker. You don't have to know how to build a Docker Compose file. You can spin up and create an environment really easily. If you're hosting with...
It's not like pick and choose. I can like quickly do a Postgres database and pull things up. Okay.
Right, yeah, and so all the containers are already set up. There's all these Docker images for each of the individual services that already exist, that are already
Can I
configured to work.
install them and then see the container files? Yes, of course.
Yeah, and you can
So I
SSH
can
into
kind
those.
of find out how they built it.
You could. You won't be able to see the Docker images unless they're stored in a GitHub repository or something.
So I can copy it. Yeah.
Yeah, but you could use the Docker images.
Okay.
Um,
All right, cool.
yeah. Any other questions?
So sometimes I notice when I do a Lando derush, I get a failure when I'm in the directory relative to the Lando YAML. But if I CD into the change directory into the web subdirectory, then it works.
Interesting.
Have you ever run into that, or do you know why that would happen?
I mean, I use Lando Drush pretty sparingly, to be honest. What I have done, and I have inside of my local settings file, I look and figure out what the actual port is that Docker is running on, and then I have a separate config with an environmental variable set up, so I can run my local version of Drush.
Oh, okay.
But because it's faster. But I have not run into that issue. I have run into the issue where you start up the project and Drush doesn't exist. It says that it doesn't exist, and in those scenarios, usually rebuilding solves the problem.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have not seen that particular issue where. Are you running on a Mac? Then I'm guessing. Yeah, I haven't seen the issue as to running Lando Drush and having an issue based on where you are in the file system. As long as you're in the some sort of subfolder of where your Lando file exists within that same directory structure, it's just worked for me in the past. But yeah, I've never quite had that problem.
So I've run into problems with local, like when you deploy into your local environment and then you have SSL activated, like sometimes it just refuses to work. Have you run into that?
I haven't run into any issues with SSL. It spins up different versions. We could actually scroll back a little bit. I think you'll see here, but it's going to give you an SSL version of the URL as well as a non-SSL.
Sometimes I get the browser like error that says like
Yeah,
you have
not
to-
secure.
not secure.
It uses Let's Encrypt, right? Doesn't it?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, so it gives a valid cert and everything. I've never, in early versions of Lando, I saw the error, but I haven't ever since.
Now, I have seen that with custom top-level domains before.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think that's usually because you don't have DNS mask configured properly, where it doesn't know where it's supposed to go. I've had that issue before, but not recently. But yeah, there's an HTTP and an HTTPS version of all the URLs for the container that you spun up.
So you're saying like when you spin it up and you go to the HTTPS, it just goes straight through?
It just worked. Well, I mean, it might say there's a warning
Yeah.
because the certificate's not signed,
Okay.
and then you just go through.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. That's pretty typical.
Is Lando.site public?
No, it's not. That's just local to your local system. But again, you could use Lando Share to share out that address externally. The URL, of course, would change in that particular instance. But
What does Lando Share use? Is it ngrok or?
let's see.
A little tidbit, you can change your host file on another computer and access your Lando-driven site from one computer to the next. It's not something you can do with docs all over again.
Then once Solar gets up and running here in a second, and this is from the repository that I've shared out. And if anybody's interested in gaining access to that, I could post it in Slack if you want, or make my slides public. Yeah, this is a pretty crazy Lando file that I've got here. This is not really typical of my normal setups, but it's important to kind of understand all that you can really do with it. But here's the Lando file from start to finish. With our name, recipe, our configuration, the individual services that we've defined here, which we've defined several, the events, and then all the proxies as well as the custom tooling. But in most scenarios, you won't have much more than 8 lines, which is pretty great. Okay, so let's see.
So you have to specify that -u.
Yeah, this is, I think you have to specify 32773. That's 774. So this is the specific URL I want to share. I think it's the local firewall, but it typically just works. So it's using localtunnel.me is what they're actually using for that service. You can see that here.
An example of the project file just being the thing you share. I'm on a large project right now where there's the Git repo is a composer.json, the Lando file, and some other things. And we have a custom script that, when you first run it, it just does everything.
Yeah.
It sets it all up. You're not, there's a larger conversation about how people use Composer, pros and cons to it, but in this sense, it's like you're not downloading any code. You watch it, you watch Composer do all its thing and try to get all the code for the site. That's probably the only thing that Git repo is the custom theme directory.
Right.
And the custom modules that we have.
And I think you can even build your own recipes. There's lots of additional configuration with the base Lando files that you can set up to really custom tailor however you need, while still keeping some of the simplicity of using Lando as opposed to running Docker commands locally. Yeah, this is the particular repository that I have set up. There's not a whole lot in here. Lando file. And again, this is just based on the Pantheon example drops, a composer file. But this is what I just threw together the other day. It's really a typical setup for what I use when I'm spinning up Drupal 8 projects. Anybody have any other questions or thoughts?
We have a guy that nerds out hardcore. He sets up all our sites so that when we do Lando and hit, or when we do the Lando start, it'll go bring in the entire site. It'll set up stage file proxy, and then it'll reset your local password and do everything. So you don't even have to do anything. It's just set up, and then you set your password for your local Drupal install, and you're ready to go.
Right.
Start development. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of power with events and build steps in particular that I haven't even touched the surface on. But like I said, basically every step of the entire Lando runtime process, there's some sort of event you can hop onto to perform some sort of action, and it just works. Let's see.
Yeah, but if you're a person who uses MAMP or tries to roll their own, Apache, stack or whatever on their laptop workstation, and you just hate it, or you're frustrated, or something breaks all the time, just jump headfirst into this.
Yeah.
However many years ago when CalBox came out, I was running MAMP Pro, and it worked, but I was always having problems with moving to the deployment targets and stuff like that. And it was about that time that I found Pantheon, and I never stopped singing their praises. Lando and Pantheon work so closely together. One of the recipes is Pantheon.
Mm-hmm. You can clone your code directly from Pantheon. You can clone your databases from whichever environment you want
Lando
from Pantheon.
pool.
Lando pool, yeah.
And you just say, I want the live database and the live files or whatever the multi-dev.
Now,
thing.
and it replicates the environment very well with, setting up whatever services are needed, varnish and all of that stuff. I will say that I have used the Pantheon recipe with success in the past, but I've also had issues with it at times where a project that's super complicated,
Yep.
where it's just very slow or just doesn't work for me. So I've kind of stopped using it, but I'm interested in taking a look at it again because the project's come a long way since I was trying that Pantheon recipe
Pantheon
over a year
is
ago.
still having a lot of teething problems with the composer workflow. So you have to learn. You don't have to learn the way to do it because there isn't just one way to do it.
Right.
That's the major pain point right now.
Yeah.
So,
But you can see here's just a list of all the different events that you can look at. So pre-destroy, post-destroy, pre-init, post-init. So basically, you can pretty much do anything and create custom commands that run at any sort of point within your build process, depending on how you get your app configured. So it's as easy as setting up a recipe and getting up and started very, very quickly. So like you said, it's similar in far as speed and getting spun up as MAMP is, but it's got a whole lot more power because it's based on Docker. And it
standardizes all those things. Like,
Absolutely. Yeah.
God forbid you update a version of your operating system and then your whole stack crashes. Like,
Right.
That just won't happen.
But there's tons of great documentation here regarding each of the individual recipes. So again, backdrop, Drupal 6, 7, 8, Joomla, Laravel, LAMP, Mean, Pantheon, and WordPress. Individual use case configuration for each of the individual services that they have that are supported, and how you can reconfigure each of those depending on your circumstances. Information on how to use each of the individual commands, as well as guides. Prior to creating all the documentation here, I was running Lando 3.0.0.0 RC1, which they had some changes that they made to their Lando files. So Mike's done a really good job of kind of keeping everything nice and organized here, walking through the process of getting everything set up. Again. Any other questions or at all? Because I don't have any more.
So maybe this is a dumb question. So it doesn't work with that other company, Acquia?
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 I'm sure that there's a way that you could get it to work with Acquia. I mean,
So Lando is just a little server on your laptop or
Right.
workstation, whatever. So if
I mean, as far as pulling and pushing.
no.
No, the pool stuff only works with Pantheon.
So I'll just map to my local Gits and local database.
Yeah, so you have all of your code base is actually on your hard drive. It's not in this server. And Lando just kind of talks to it over the built-in network shares that are going on. It just runs MySQL and PHP and everything in its own buckets. So you can do your Git pulls and Git commits and all your Git commands, on your console locally to Acquia. Lando is just providing, the server on your laptop.
Okay.
Yeah. But for getting the database and the files, you have to go through Acquia's workflow to get that.
Okay.
Right.
And then there's a Lando command, db-import.
And DB export, yeah.
Right.
There was another project that did something similar a long while ago.
Acquia Desktop. They
Dev
have their own
Desktop, yeah.
tool,
It was
but
Dev
they
Desktop.
don't support it anymore.
It's called
Everybody's
Dev
using it.
Desktop.
Right.
That's what I use every day. They don't support
What was
it.
it?
Maybe. I thought they had
Yeah.
canceled it.
I think back in the day, Vagrant used to be what this kind of
Yes.
was.
Yeah, that's what we use,
And
and it's a pain.
I tell you, I had issues with Vagrant all the time. Like, it got to the point where I just stopped.
Well, the performance just
Yeah.
isn't nearly the same as running Docker
That's what
locally.
kills us is the performance.
You don't have that with this.
Yeah.
It might crap out now and then when they're like, they've like released a new release and there's like a little bug or something like that, but they're quick to fix it. You don't nearly have the issues
Yeah.
that we have.
And there would be times where maybe.
Replace my Dev Desktop.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
There will be times, and I have this experience probably a couple times a week, where the file syncing from my local file system to the volume for Docker gets stalled, and say I make a CSS change and it's not immediately visible. In those instances, you do have to restart Docker, but it's not a Lando issue; it's a Docker
It's a
issue.
Docker issue.
Right.
Yeah.
Docker's heavy.
But there are a few things like that. But yeah,
Those trade-offs, like saying those little bugs in Docker and stuff like that, the flexibility, functionality, and power of Lando completely makes it worth it compared to like,
yeah.
whatever I was doing with MAMP before.
Yeah.
You know.
And so here's where you can specify your disk size for Docker. So in that, you were talking earlier, I've had this problem before where I've filled it up completely and things just don't work. It's really easy to change that within here. I don't know why they don't allow you to select more than this, but it's just really easy to scale it and restart it as needed.
When that happened to me, Docker didn't let you rescale it.
Yeah.
It was 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, it might have been. Yeah, Docker for Mac's come a long way too. And it's getting better. But really, I use Lando every single day. It's just made my life a whole lot easier, and I don't have to deal with MAMP anymore, and I can install whatever service I need to for a particular project. And the pros definitely way outweigh the cons, like for Docker stalling my files or something like that. It just works.
And there are competitors, there's DDEV and there's Doxel. And they're good, but I've tried them. I've done everything under the sun as far as a local dev environment. I've tried to use like Macs. Like, let me install PHP and Apache and
Yeah, you could do
use
those.
Mac, but then your Mac updates and then something's wrong.
Well, yeah, I used to use Brew and switch between versions of PHP and
Yeah.
things on my local file system. That was kind of the way I used to do things.
Yeah.
Until I started using Docker and then now Lando.
Yeah, but Lando's been amazing. It's just been a game changer.
Yeah. You should definitely try it out.
Don't crash our system.
Yeah.
Trying to get it working.
I use this too, because I was messing around with trying to even figure out how to create a local development environment.
Right.
And I tried some other things, and I'm like, it seems complicated. And then I landed on this, and I'm like, hey, that's easy. I figured it out. Any idiot can do it.
Right.
And even like billables, so say like you set up for a client, like we were in support, and we have clients that when you need to onboard, you need to set up a local site. I might have 10 to 30 sites that I'm working on. And you need to set them up when you first onboard, and then you always like pass that cost in the initial setup to the client, right? You have like 5 or 6 devs. Well, that's 5 or 6 devs setting up their locals, right? And it's hard to tell the client that just to get started and set up
I know.
on your site, this is how much it's going to be. But, something like Lando, you
Yeah.
can get everybody up in like not even 15 minutes. It's
Yeah.
cut down costs.
It does make it easier. I typically just put a README file inside of the document root for any sort of additional customizations like I have. Because my build process, I have a settings.local file that I'm symlinking and some other things like that, and whatever Lando commands, perform specific actions like that. It makes it easier for sure. But yeah, that's all I got.
Thank you.
Cool.